Picture this: Rome, 41 AD. The most powerful man in the world lies bleeding on the cold marble floor of his own palace. His screams echo through the corridors as swords pierce his flesh again and again. The assassins? Not foreign invaders, not rebellious slaves, not rival generals from distant provinces. No, the men butchering the Emperor of Rome are his own bodyguards, the very soldiers sworn to protect him with their lives. This is the Praetorian Guard, and this is their story, a tale of the only military unit in history that held the power of life and death over the rulers of the greatest empire the world has ever known. For over 3 centuries, these elite warriors stood at the absolute center of Roman power. They were supposed to be the emperor's shield, his iron wall against assassination and revolt. Instead, they became kingmakers and kingbreakers, auctioning the throne to the highest bidder, murdering emperors like livestock, and turning the capital of civilization into their personal playground of blood and gold. Their story is one of absolute corruption, spectacular violence, and the dark truth that those closest to power are often the most dangerous. This is not just military history. This is a thriller written in blood on the marble steps of the Roman Forum. Let's go back to the beginning to understand how Rome created its own monster. In 27 BC, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, faced a unique problem. The Roman Republic had just torn itself apart in decades of civil war. Julius Caesar had been stabbed to death by senators who feared his power. Mark Antony had fallen in Egypt. The Republic was dead, and Augustus stood alone as master of the known world. But he was smart enough to know that every dictator needs protection, not from foreign enemies, but from his own people, from senators with daggers hidden in their togas, from ambitious generals plotting in their camps, from anyone who might want to take his place. Augustus needed bodyguards, but not just any soldiers. Regular legionaries were stationed far from Rome, fighting on distant frontiers. The Senate, still pretending the Republic existed, would never allow armed troops inside the sacred city limits. This was an ancient law, a line that could not be crossed. But Augustus was clever. He created something new, something that had never existed before: the Praetorian Guard. The name came from the Praetorium, the tent of a Roman general in military camps. These were guards who stood watch over the commander himself. Augustus took this concept and transformed it into an elite force of 9 cohorts, around 4,500 men, hand-picked from the best soldiers in Italy. These weren't just any legionaries. They were taller, stronger, more disciplined. They served for only 16 years compared to the 25 required of regular soldiers. And here's the key: they were paid 3 times as much as normal legionaries, 3 times the salary for half the danger, stationed in the capital city instead of freezing on the German frontier or baking in the Egyptian desert. Augustus stationed 3 cohorts inside Rome itself, breaking that sacred law, and scattered the rest around Italy. He put them under the command of 2 Praetorian prefects, equestrian-class officers who answered directly to him. On paper, it looked reasonable, a small security force for the emperor. In reality, Augustus had just armed a group of soldiers, given them wealth and privilege beyond any other military unit, and positioned them at the throat of the empire. For the first decades, everything worked. Augustus ruled with intelligence and restraint. The Praetorians were his loyal servants, standing guard in their distinctive armor, symbols of imperial power and stability. They marched in ceremonies, protected the emperor during public appearances, and generally behaved like the elite force they were meant to be. But Augustus made one critical mistake, a mistake that would echo through centuries. He made the Praetorians dependent on the emperor's generosity, not on military discipline or republican virtue. Their loyalty was bought, and anything bought can be bought again by someone else. When Augustus died in 14 AD, something interesting happened. His stepson Tiberius became emperor, but he needed the Praetorian Guard's approval. He paid them a donative, a special bonus to secure their loyalty. This set a precedent that would haunt every emperor who followed. Each new ruler had to pay the Praetorians to accept him. The bodyguards were becoming power brokers. Tiberius made the situation worse. In 23 AD, he appointed a man named Sejanus as sole Praetorian prefect, breaking Augustus's rule of having two commanders to check each other's power. Sejanus was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He convinced Tiberius to build a permanent fortress for the Praetorians on the edge of Rome, the Castra Praetoria, concentrating all 9 cohorts in one location for the first time. Now the Guard wasn't scattered and manageable. It was a unified military force inside the capital, 10,000 strong, living in a fortified camp, with a single commander who controlled them all. Sejanus used this power to become the real ruler of Rome, while Tiberius withdrew to the island of Capri. The Praetorian prefect controlled access to the emperor, eliminated rivals through treason trials, and plotted to seize the throne himself. For years he was untouchable. The Praetorians followed his orders, not Tiberius's. This revealed the fundamental flaw in the system. Whoever controlled the Guard controlled Rome, regardless of what the Senate or the emperor wanted. Tiberius eventually realized the danger and had Sejanus arrested and executed in 31 AD, but the damage was done. The Praetorians had tasted real power. They had seen their commander manipulate the emperor, dominate the Senate, and rule the empire from behind the throne. They learned a lesson they would never forget. The emperor was not a god. He was just a man, and men could be controlled, manipulated, or if necessary, killed. This brings us to Caligula, and the moment everything changed forever. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known as Caligula or Little Boot, became emperor in 37 AD amid great celebration. The Romans loved him at first. He was young, charismatic, the great-grandson of Augustus, son of the beloved general Germanicus. The Praetorians adored him. He gave them generous bonuses and treated them like his personal companions. For a brief moment, it seemed like Rome had found a worthy ruler. Then Caligula went insane. Historians still debate whether he had a mental illness, whether power corrupted him absolutely, or whether the ancient sources exaggerated his madness. But the accounts are consistent and horrifying. Caligula declared himself a living god and demanded worship. He had people tortured and killed for his amusement. He allegedly made his horse a consul. He launched pointless military campaigns and wasted the treasury Augustus had carefully built up. He seduced the wives of senators and boasted about it publicly. He humiliated the aristocracy, mocked the Senate, and treated Rome like his personal toy. But most dangerously, Caligula began to suspect the Praetorian Guard itself. Paranoia consumed him. He saw assassins everywhere, and he wasn't entirely wrong. By 41 AD, after 4 years of increasingly deranged rule, Rome was a powder keg waiting to explode. Senators whispered about tyrannicide. The people who had once cheered Caligula now feared and hated him. And the Praetorians, the men closest to the emperor, began to wonder if their generous paychecks were worth serving a madman. A conspiracy formed, and at its center was a Praetorian tribune named Cassius Chaerea. This man had served with distinction, a tough veteran who commanded respect from his soldiers. But Caligula mocked him constantly, calling him weak, questioning his manhood, giving him humiliating passwords like Priapus or Venus when he came for the daily watch. For a proud Roman officer, this was unbearable. Chaerea's personal hatred merged with a broader conspiracy involving other Praetorian officers, senators, and members of the imperial household. They all wanted Caligula dead. On January 24th, 41 AD, during the Palatine Games, the conspirators struck. Caligula was moving through a narrow underground passage beneath the palace, heading from the theater to his private quarters. The passageway was cramped, with walls close on both sides. Chaerea and another tribune, Cornelius Sabinus, were waiting. Chaerea stepped forward and asked Caligula for the day's password, a routine request that wouldn't raise suspicion. As Caligula turned to answer, Chaerea drew his sword and struck, slashing the emperor across the neck. Caligula cried out and fell. The passage erupted in violence. Other conspirators rushed forward, stabbing frantically. Caligula tried to crawl away, blood pouring from multiple wounds, but the assassins surrounded him. According to the historian Suetonius, they stabbed him 30 times, including wounds to his genitals, a deliberate humiliation. The Emperor of Rome died like a dog in a dark hallway, butchered by his own guards. But the killing didn't stop there. The Praetorians, their bloodlust unleashed, murdered Caligula's wife Caesonia and smashed his infant daughter's head against a wall. The entire imperial family was wiped out in minutes of savage violence. This was the moment that changed everything. The Praetorian Guard had killed an emperor, not in battle, not in some distant province, but in the heart of Rome, inside the imperial palace itself. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The precedent was set. If the Praetorians decided an emperor had to die, he would die, and no power on earth could stop them. Now here's where the story takes an even more interesting turn. With Caligula dead and his family massacred, Rome had no emperor. The Senate, that ancient body that had ruled Rome for 500 years before the emperors came, saw an opportunity. Perhaps the Republic could be restored. Perhaps Rome could go back to being governed by the aristocracy, not by a single autocrat protected by Praetorian swords. Senators began to debate in the forum, discussing a return to republican government. The Praetorians had other ideas. While senators talked, the guard fanned out through the palace, looting and searching. A soldier named Gratus found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain, terrified that he would be killed too. Claudius was 50 years old, dismissed by everyone as a crippled fool with a stammer, totally unsuitable for power. But to the Praetorians, he was perfect, a member of the imperial family, pliable, grateful, and most importantly, someone who would owe his throne entirely to them. The soldiers dragged Claudius to the Praetorian camp and proclaimed him emperor. The Senate was still debating. Claudius was already on the throne, backed by 10,000 armed men. The senators had no troops, no power, nothing but words. They caved immediately. Claudius became emperor, but everyone understood the real truth. The Praetorian Guard had just chosen the emperor of Rome. not the Senate, not the people, not the gods or fate or tradition, the Praetorians. And Claudius paid them for it. He gave each Praetorian 15,000 sesterces, an enormous sum, 5 years' salary for a regular legionary. This donative was not a gift, it was a purchase. Claudius was buying the throne, and the Praetorians were selling it. The precedent was even more dangerous than Caligula's assassination. The Guard had learned they could not only kill emperors, but make them too, and profit handsomely from both. Claudius ruled for 13 years, and despite everyone's expectations, he was actually a competent emperor. He conquered Britain, built infrastructure, managed the empire efficiently. But he never forgot who really held power. He kept the Praetorians happy, paid, and honored. When he died in 54 AD, probably poisoned by his wife Agrippina, the Praetorians immediately backed her son Nero as the new emperor. Another transition, another payment, another reinforcement of the pattern. Nero started well, but descended into tyranny, cruelty, and madness that made even Caligula look restrained. He murdered his mother, his wife, and countless senators. He burned Rome and blamed Christians, launching the first persecution. He bankrupted the treasury with his extravagance. By 68 AD, even the Praetorians had had enough, or more precisely, provincial governors with their own armies rebelled, and the Guard decided that backing a losing emperor was bad for business. The Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus betrayed Nero, promising the Guard even larger donatives if they switched their loyalty to Galba, a governor marching on Rome. The Praetorians abandoned Nero, who fled the city and committed suicide. The year of the 4 emperors had begun. In 69 AD, Rome saw 4 different men claim the throne: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. The Praetorians were at the center of all of it. They killed Galba when he refused to pay the promised donative, literally hacking him to pieces in the Forum. They backed Otho, who paid them generously, then switched to Vitellius when he offered more. It was chaos, civil war, and the Guard was loving it, profiting from every change of regime. Vespasian finally restored order, founding the Flavian dynasty and ruling with firm competence. He and his sons, Titus and Domitian, kept the Praetorians under control through a combination of payments, discipline, and political skill. For 30 years, there was relative stability. But Domitian became paranoid and tyrannical, and in 96 AD he was assassinated by court officials. The Praetorians, interestingly, were not directly involved this time, but they accepted his death and the Senate's choice of Nerva as emperor, as long as the money kept flowing. The 2nd century AD saw Rome's greatest period of stability and prosperity under the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These men ruled wisely, expanded the empire to its greatest extent, and kept the Praetorians reasonably content. The Guard still held immense power, but competent emperors could manage them through respect, discipline, and regular payments. It seemed like the system might actually work. Then came Commodus, Marcus Aurelius's son, and everything fell apart again. Commodus was another emperor who descended into madness and megalomania. He believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules and fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, forcing senators to watch him kill animals and disabled opponents. He renamed Rome after himself, called the months of the year by his various titles, and bankrupted the treasury. By 192 AD, a conspiracy formed, including his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain, and crucially, the Praetorian prefect Latus. On December 31st, 192 A.D., Marcia poisoned Commodus's wine, but he vomited up the poison. So they sent in Narcissus, a wrestler, who strangled the emperor in his bath. The Praetorians, under Laetus's direction, accepted this assassination. They backed Pertinax, an elderly senator and military veteran, as the new emperor. Pertinax was honorable, disciplined, and determined to restore Rome's finances and military discipline. The Praetorians hated him immediately. Pertinax tried to reform their privileges, reduce their donatives, and impose actual discipline on the guard. After just 3 months, on March 28, 193 A.D., a group of Praetorians marched to the palace and murdered Pertinax, stabbing him to death despite his attempts to reason with them. He was the second emperor in 3 months to die at Praetorian hands. And then the Praetorian Guard did something absolutely unprecedented, something so brazen and corrupt that it shocked even the cynical Romans. They auctioned the Roman Empire. With Pertinax dead, the Praetorians returned to their camp and literally put the throne up for sale to the highest bidder. 2 wealthy senators, Didius Julianus and Sulpicianus, gathered outside the walls of the Castra Praetoria. The Praetorians shouted out the bidding from the ramparts, like auctioneers at a slave market. Sulpicianus offered 20,000 sesterces per soldier. Julianus countered with 25,000. Sulpicianus raised to 30,000. The bidding continued, back and forth, while Rome watched in horror and disbelief. Finally, Didius Julianus won with a bid of 25,000 sesterces per soldier, 6,250 denarii, an astronomical sum. The gates of the camp opened, and Julianus entered. The Praetorians proclaimed him emperor. He paid them immediately, and they escorted him to the Senate, which had no choice but to confirm him. The empire of Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius had been sold like a piece of furniture. This was the absolute nadir of the Praetorian Guard's corruption. They were no longer even pretending to serve Rome or the emperor. They were mercenaries, pure and simple, selling their loyalty to whoever paid the most. The ancient historian Cassius Dio, writing decades later, captured the disgust perfectly. When the soldiers had slain Pertinax, they made it known to all that the imperial power was for sale, and they set up a kind of auction, offering the empire to the one who should bid the highest. But the Praetorians had overplayed their hand. Across the empire, provincial governors with legions under their command were outraged. 3 powerful generals declared themselves emperor: Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus in Pannonia, commanding the fierce Danubian legions. Severus was closest to Rome and moved first. Didius Julianus's purchased reign lasted just 66 days. As Severus marched on Rome, the Praetorians realized they had backed the wrong horse. The Senate condemned Julianus, and the Guard abandoned him. He was executed in the palace on June 1st, 193 A.D. The man who bought the empire died alone, deserted by the soldiers he had paid so lavishly. Severus entered Rome with his legions, and he was absolutely furious at the Praetorian Guard. These pampered, corrupt soldiers had murdered emperors, auctioned the throne, and disgraced Rome. Severus assembled the entire Praetorian Guard on a field outside the city, ordering them to appear in full ceremonial dress. They obeyed, still hoping they could buy his favor. Severus surrounded them with his legionaries, tough veterans from the frontier. Then he addressed the Praetorians with cold contempt, cataloging their crimes, their murders, their treachery. As he spoke, his soldiers moved closer, weapons ready. The Praetorians realized too late that they were trapped. Severus stripped them of their rank, discharged them in disgrace, and banished them from Rome on pain of death. The Praetorian Guard, as it had existed for over 200 years, was dissolved in a single afternoon. But Severus was practical. He still needed a Praetorian force to protect the emperor. So he created a new Praetorian Guard, recruited not from Italy, but from his own legions, hard men from the frontiers who had proven their loyalty in battle. He increased their size to 15,000 men, gave them higher pay than even the old guard had enjoyed, and made sure they understood that their loyalty was to him personally, not to some abstract concept of duty or honor. This new Praetorian Guard was different in character, but not in power. They were still an elite force in Rome with the physical capability to kill emperors. And within a few decades, they were doing exactly that. Severus's reforms had purged the old guard's corruption, but the structural problem remained. Any group of armed soldiers stationed in the capital, dependent on the emperor for their privileged status, would inevitably become a threat to imperial stability. The 3rd century A.D. was chaos for Rome, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. The empire faced barbarian invasions, plague, economic collapse, and a rapid succession of emperors, most of whom died violently. Between 235 and 284 A.D., Rome had over 50 emperors, and the Praetorian Guard killed at least a dozen of them. They murdered Elagabalus in 222 A.D., when his bizarre religious practices and sexual excesses became intolerable. They killed Pupienus and Balbinus in 238 A.D., strangling both co-emperors in the palace. They assassinated Aurelian in 275 A.D., one of Rome's greatest military reformers, because a forged letter convinced them he planned to execute their commanders. Again and again, the Praetorians proved that they were the most dangerous threat any emperor faced. By the late 3rd century, capable military emperors like Diocletian were spending most of their time fighting on distant frontiers, not lounging in Rome. The Praetorian Guard's influence began to wane as emperors relied more on their field armies and less on the Guard for protection. But the Praetorians still held enormous symbolic and practical power in Italy. They controlled access to Rome, influenced the Senate, and could make any emperor's reign miserable if they chose. This brings us to Constantine and the final destruction of the Praetorian Guard. In 306 A.D., the Roman Empire was divided among multiple claimants to power. Constantine, son of the Emperor Constantius, began his bid for supreme control. He was brilliant, ruthless, and determined to reunify the empire under his sole rule. Standing in his way was Maxentius, who controlled Italy and had the support of the Praetorian Guard. Maxentius relied heavily on the Praetorians. They were his power base, his enforcers, the military muscle that kept him in control of Rome. When Constantine invaded Italy in 312 A.D., the Praetorian Guard marched out to defend their emperor, confident in their prowess and their long history of invincibility. On October 28, 312 A.D., the two armies met at the Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome. Constantine's forces were outnumbered but better disciplined and more experienced. The battle was fierce, fought on the banks of the Tiber River. Constantine's troops pushed forward relentlessly. The Praetorians, for all their reputation and privilege, were not frontline combat soldiers. They were palace guards, urban troops who had spent generations intimidating unarmed senators and murdering isolated emperors. Against Constantine's hardened veterans, they broke. Maxentius and thousands of his soldiers, including many Praetorians, drowned in the Tiber when a bridge collapsed during their retreat. The rest fled back to Rome. Constantine pursued them into the city itself. This time, there would be no negotiations, no bribes, no new donatives to buy the Praetorians' loyalty. Constantine entered Rome as master of the West, and one of his first acts was to disband the Praetorian Guard permanently. He dismantled the Castra Praetoria, tearing down the fortress that had stood for nearly 300 years. He scattered the remaining Praetorians to frontier garrisons, breaking up their units and stripping them of their elite status. The Guard's property was confiscated, their privileges revoked, their very name erased from the imperial rolls. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor-makers and emperor-killers, the soldiers who had auctioned Rome itself, simply ceased to exist. Constantine replaced them with a new imperial bodyguard, the Scholae Palatinae, recruited from barbarian warriors with no ties to Roman politics or tradition. These new guards were foreigners, loyal only to the emperor who paid them, with no institutional memory of murdering rulers or selling thrones. Constantine had learned the lesson that took Rome 3 centuries to understand. You cannot trust an elite military unit stationed in your capital with too much power and too little accountability. The destruction of the Praetorian Guard in 312 AD was more than just a military reform. It was the end of an era, the final chapter in one of history's most remarkable stories of institutional corruption and military power run amok. So, what do we make of the Praetorian Guard? How do we understand this organization that lasted over 300 years, that protected some emperors and murdered others, that defended Rome from its enemies while simultaneously being Rome's greatest internal threat? The Praetorians were a product of a fundamental contradiction in the Roman imperial system. The emperors needed protection, but armed guards are themselves dangerous. The guard needed to be powerful enough to defend the emperor from real threats, but that same power made them capable of killing him. They needed to be loyal, but loyalty bought with gold can always be bought again by someone else. This was an unsolvable problem, a structural flaw in the very foundation of imperial Rome. Augustus created the Praetorian Guard because he needed them. Every emperor after him kept them for the same reason, even knowing the danger, because the alternative, being unprotected in a city full of potential assassins, was worse. It's like keeping a tiger as a guard dog. Yes, it's terrifying and dangerous and might eat you, but it also keeps everyone else away. The Romans chose the tiger and paid the price repeatedly. The Praetorians killed at least 13 emperors directly and were complicit in the deaths of many more. They wounded Rome's political stability, turned imperial succession into a mercenary transaction, and corrupted the principle of merit-based rule. Yet they also provided genuine security for many emperors, defended Rome from riots and uprisings, and occasionally removed genuinely terrible rulers like Caligula who needed to be stopped. The individual Praetorians were not monsters. They were soldiers, men from Italy and later from across the empire, who joined an elite unit that offered prestige, wealth, and power. Most of them never killed an emperor. Most served their terms, took their bonuses, and retired to comfortable lives. But the institution they belonged to was structurally designed to create corruption. When you pay soldiers triple the normal rate, station them in the capital where politics is a blood sport, and make their comfort dependent on pleasing whoever sits on the throne, you create overwhelming incentives for them to involve themselves in power struggles. The Praetorian Guard story is a warning that echoes through history. Every dictatorship, every autocracy, every system built around the power of a single ruler faces the same problem. Who guards the guardians? How do you protect yourself from your protectors? The Romans never solved this puzzle. They just endured it for 3 centuries until Constantine cut the knot by destroying the guard entirely. And perhaps there's a broader lesson here about power itself. The Praetorians started as a reasonable response to a real problem. Augustus genuinely needed protection. But power, once created, develops its own logic, its own momentum. The Guard's power grew generation by generation, precedent by precedent, until they were effectively choosing emperors. No one planned this. No one wanted it. It just happened. The inevitable result of placing armed men at the center of political power and rewarding them for loyalty rather than virtue. In the end, the Praetorian Guard was destroyed not by morality or reform, but by superior military force. Constantine beat them on the battlefield and dismantled them administratively. The lesson is stark. Institutions of power cannot reform themselves. They must be broken from outside by someone with the strength and will to do it. The ruins of the Castra Praetoria still exist in Rome, incorporated into a modern military barracks. You can walk past walls that once sheltered the men who killed Caligula, who auctioned the empire, who made and unmade emperors for 300 years. The stones are silent now, but they witnessed events that shaped the course of Western civilization. The Praetorian Guard's legacy is complex. They were elite soldiers and corrupt mercenaries, defenders of Rome and its greatest internal threat, a necessary evil that became an unnecessary evil, but couldn't be eliminated until an emperor strong enough and ruthless enough finally did what had needed doing for generations. They were, in every sense, the only Roman soldiers who could kill an emperor, and they proved it again and again, until an emperor finally killed them first. Their story reminds us that power always seeks to preserve itself, that privilege once granted is nearly impossible to revoke, and that the greatest danger to any ruler often comes not from foreign enemies, but from the armed men standing right behind the throne. The Praetorians understood this better than anyone. They lived it, exploited it, and ultimately died because of it. This is the complete story, from Augustus's creation of an imperial bodyguard in 27 BC to Constantine's destruction of that same institution in 312 AD. 340 years of power, corruption, violence, and political manipulation, all carried out by men in distinctive armor, standing at the center of the greatest empire in ancient history. They were supposed to be guardians. They became killers. And in the end, they were killed themselves, erased from history by the very system they had corrupted so thoroughly. The Praetorian Guard is gone, but their shadow remains. Every time a military coup overthrows a government, every time palace guards turn on their ruler, every time protectors become predators, we see echoes of the Praetorians. They wrote the playbook for military intervention in politics, for the commodification of loyalty, for the dangers of creating an armed elite without proper accountability. We're still learning their lessons today, still grappling with the questions they raised, still trying to solve the puzzle that Rome never quite figured out. How do you create security without creating threat, protection without creating danger? guardians without creating guards who might one day decide they should be in charge. That's the story of the Praetorian Guard, the only Roman soldiers who could kill an emperor, and often did. But let's dive deeper into the mechanics of how they actually operated, because understanding their daily reality helps explain how they became so dangerous. The Praetorian Guard wasn't just a group of soldiers. They were a complete parallel power structure within Rome, with their own economy, their own politics, their own code of conduct that often contradicted official Roman values. A young man joining the Praetorian Guard entered a world of privilege that would have been unimaginable to a regular legionary. First, the recruitment standards were supposedly higher. You had to be Italian-born, at least until Septimius Severus changed that rule. You had to be taller than average, physically impressive, from a respectable family. The Praetorians wanted men who looked the part, who could stand information and intimidate through sheer presence. Once accepted, a new Praetorian received equipment that marked him as special. His armor was finer, often decorated with silver or gold. His helmet was distinctive, designed to catch the eye. He carried an oval shield, different from the rectangular scutum of the legions. When Praetorians marched through Rome, everyone knew exactly who they were. This wasn't an accident. The guard was meant to be visible, a constant reminder of the emperor's power and protection. The pay structure reveals everything about Roman priorities. A regular legionary earned 225 denarii per year under Augustus, later raised to 300. A Praetorian earned 720 denarii annually, more than triple. But the real money came from donatives, those special bonuses paid by emperors. When Claudius gave each Praetorian 15,000 sesterces, that was equivalent to 21 years of a regular legionary's salary, paid all at once. No wonder the Guard developed a taste for regime change. Every new emperor meant another massive payday. Their service term was shorter too, just 16 years instead of 25, later reduced to 12. This meant a Praetorian could join at 20, serve his term, and retire at 32 or 36 with enormous savings, still young enough to enjoy civilian life. Compare this to a legionary who joined at 20 and, if he survived, retired at 45, worn out and old by Roman standards. The Praetorians had it easy, and they knew it. Living conditions matched the pay. The Castra Praetoria, built under Sejanus, was more like a luxury barracks than a military camp. Individual Praetorians had better quarters, better food, access to Rome's amenities. They weren't stationed in some God-forsaken frontier fort eating porridge and fighting Germans. They were in the capital, able to visit theaters, bathhouses, taverns, and brothels whenever off duty. For ambitious young men from Italian towns, joining the Praetorian Guard was like winning the lottery. This comfort bred entitlement, and entitlement bred political involvement. The Praetorians saw themselves as Rome's elite, superior not just to regular soldiers, but to many civilians. They interacted daily with senators, imperial officials, and the emperor himself. They heard palace gossip, knew state secrets, understood the real power dynamics of the empire. This knowledge was dangerous because it demystified imperial authority. The Praetorians knew the emperor wasn't divine. They saw him eating, sleeping, dealing with petty problems like any other man. And if he was just a man, well, men could be replaced. The command structure of the Praetorian Guard also contributed to their political power. The Praetorian prefects were among the most important officials in the empire, second only to the emperor himself, They commanded 10,000 armed men in Rome, controlled access to the emperor, often served as the emperor's chief advisors, and could use their position to accumulate enormous wealth and influence. Men like Sejanus, Burrus, and Perennis wielded power that rivaled emperors. Smart emperors tried to balance this by appointing 2 prefects to check each other. Weak or lazy emperors like Tiberius appointed just 1, concentrating too much power in a single ambitious man. The quality of the Praetorian prefect could determine the stability of an entire reign. A loyal, competent prefect like Burrus, who served Nero in his early good years, could help a young emperor rule effectively. A treacherous prefect like Nymphidius Sabinus could destroy an emperor overnight by turning the guard against him. The assassination of Caligula deserves even closer examination because it established patterns that would repeat throughout Praetorian history. Cassius Chaerea wasn't just angry about personal insults. He represented a broader conspiracy that included other Praetorian tribunes, court officials, and probably some senators. The planning was meticulous. They waited for the right moment during games when Caligula would be moving through confined spaces with minimal security. They chose a location, that underground passageway, where the emperor would be vulnerable and escape would be difficult. The actual killing was brutal but efficient. Chaerea's first blow to the neck was meant to be fatal, but Caligula was tougher than expected. He didn't die immediately. The sources describe him calling for help, trying to fight back despite his wounds, crawling on the ground as multiple assassins stabbed him repeatedly. This wasn't a clean political assassination. It was a frenzied murder driven by months or years of pent-up hatred and fear. The conspirators needed Caligula not just dead, but destroyed, which explains why they stabbed him 30 times and mutilated his body. The murder of Caligula's wife and daughter was calculated to prevent any possibility of revenge or restoration. Caesonia could have claimed regency for her infant daughter. Supporters might have rallied around the child as Caligula's heir. The Praetorians eliminated this possibility with characteristic ruthlessness. They smashed the baby's head against a wall, according to Suetonius, an act of such savage cruelty that it shocked even Romans accustomed to political violence. What's most significant is what happened immediately after. There was chaos in the palace, but the Praetorians didn't panic. They took control, secured the area, and began looking for the next emperor. This shows organizational discipline and political sophistication. They weren't just murderous thugs. They were calculating power brokers who understood exactly what they were doing and what opportunities Caligula's death created. Finding Claudius hiding behind a curtain was presented by ancient historians as almost comical, but it reveals the Praetorians' strategic thinking. Claudius was perfect for their purposes, legitimately connected to the imperial family through blood, old enough to seem credible, yet physically unimpressive and presumably easy to control. The soldier Gratus who found Claudius probably wasn't acting on his own initiative. Someone in the Praetorian command structure had likely identified Claudius as the preferred successor before the assassination even happened. The march to the Praetorian camp with Claudius was a masterstroke of political theater. The Guard physically removed the new emperor from the Senate's sphere of influence and placed him in their fortress, surrounded by their soldiers, completely dependent on their support. When the Senate tried to assert authority, they found themselves facing a fait accompli. The Praetorians had an emperor, he had their backing, and the senators had no military force to oppose them. The Republic's ghost was laid to rest permanently in that moment. Claudius's enormous donative to the Praetorians wasn't generosity. It was tribute, protection money paid to a gang that had just demonstrated their power to kill with impunity. Every subsequent emperor understood this dynamic. You paid the Praetorians, or they might decide to find someone who would. This turned imperial succession into a financial transaction as much as a political or military one. The year of the four emperors in 69 AD showed the Praetorian system at its most chaotic and revealed how the Guard's political involvement could destabilize the entire empire. When Nero died, there was no clear heir. The Praetorians backed Galba, but Galba was an old-fashioned disciplinarian who believed soldiers should serve for honor, not money. He refused to pay the promised donative, a fatal mistake. The Praetorians murdered him in the Roman Forum, hunting him down like an animal as he tried to escape. The sources describe Galba's death in gruesome detail. An old man of 73, he was pulled from his litter and butchered by Praetorian soldiers. Someone cut off his head and brought it to Otho, the next claimant. Others mutilated his body. His corpse lay in the Forum for hours before being recovered for burial. This public murder of an emperor in the heart of Rome demonstrated that the Praetorians no longer feared any consequences for their actions. They could kill emperors in broad daylight and suffer no punishment because they were the punishment in Rome. Otho bought their support with lavish promises, but he faced opposition from Vitellius, who commanded the Rhine legions. When Otho's forces were defeated at the Battle of Bedriacum, he committed suicide, and the Praetorians immediately switched to Vitellius. Their loyalty lasted exactly as long as it was financially advantageous. Vitellius in turn was overthrown by Vespasian's forces, and the Praetorians backed another winner. They were developing a reputation as fair-weather supporters, loyal only to victory and money. This mercenary attitude reached its zenith, or nadir, with the auction of 193 A.D. The very idea of auctioning the Roman Empire seems almost too absurd to be real, but multiple sources confirm it. Didius Julianus and Sulpicianus literally stood outside the Praetorian camp, shouting their bids while soldiers on the walls relayed offers back and forth. The city of Rome watched this spectacle with a mixture of horror and fascination. The empire of Augustus, which had brought peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean world, was being sold like a farm animal. Didius Julianus's winning bid of 25,000 sesterces per soldier totaled approximately 250 million sesterces for the entire guard, an astronomical sum that he presumably didn't actually have in ready cash. He must have promised payment based on imperial revenues, effectively mortgaging the empire's future. The Praetorians didn't care about long-term consequences. They wanted immediate payment, and Julianus promised it. The auction's aftermath showed the limits of Praetorian power. They could make emperors in Rome, but they couldn't control the legions on the frontiers. Septimius Severus commanded battle-hardened soldiers who despised the pampered Praetorians. When Severus marched on Italy, the Guard's courage evaporated. They had spent generations bullying unarmed civilians and murdering isolated emperors. They had no experience fighting real soldiers in real battles. Severus's approach to Rome was a military parade, not a campaign. The Praetorians surrendered without significant resistance. Severus's humiliation of the old Praetorian Guard was deliberately theatrical. He summoned them to assemble outside Rome, apparently for a review. They came in their finest armor, expecting perhaps to intimidate him or negotiate favorable terms. Instead, Severus surrounded them with his legionaries and publicly stripped them of their honors. He didn't kill them, which showed a certain restraint, but he destroyed their identity. Discharged in disgrace, forbidden to approach Rome, stripped of their wealth and status, the old Praetorians were scattered to the winds. Many probably died in poverty, their lavish savings confiscated, their prestigious service worthless. The new Praetorian Guard created by Severus was supposed to be different, recruited from loyal frontier legions. But within a generation, they were exhibiting the same behaviors as their predecessors. The problem wasn't the individual soldiers, it was the institutional structure. Any group given the Praetorians' privileges and position would inevitably become politically involved and eventually corrupt. Severus had treated the symptom, not the disease. The crisis of the 3rd century saw the new Praetorian Guard fully embracing their predecessors' worst traditions. They killed Elagabalus not for reasons of state, but because his eccentricities embarrassed them. Elagabalus was a teenage emperor who worshipped a Syrian sun god, wore makeup and women's clothing, and allegedly tried to transition gender. Incredibly progressive for ancient Rome, but utterly unacceptable to the conservative Praetorians. They murdered him and his mother, threw their bodies in the Tiber, and installed his cousin Alexander Severus, who was more conventionally Roman. The double murder of Pupienus and Balbinus in 238 AD was particularly revealing. These elderly senators had been appointed co-emperors by the Senate during a period of chaos. They distrusted each other and the Praetorians equally. The Guard resented being overlooked in the succession and simply killed both emperors simultaneously, strangling them in the palace. There was no pretense of justification, no claim that the emperors were tyrants. The Praetorians killed them because they could, and because they wanted a different emperor who would be more generous. The assassination of Aurelian in 275 AD showed how dangerous the Praetorians could be even to competent emperors. Aurelian was one of Rome's great military reformers, a tough soldier who had reunified the empire after it had fragmented. He should have been safe from the Guard, respected for his military prowess and firm leadership. But a forged letter, supposedly from Aurelian ordering the execution of several Praetorian officers, convinced the Guard to strike first. They murdered him during a campaign, eliminating one of the few men capable of saving the empire from the chaos of the 3rd century. By the time Constantine fought Maxentius in 312 AD, the Praetorian Guard had existed for 339 years and had become a historical institution, part of Rome's identity. Many Romans couldn't imagine the empire without the Praetorians. They had been there so long through so many regimes that they seemed permanent. Constantine understood that this permanence was an illusion and a liability. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was decisive not just militarily, but symbolically. Constantine's forces were veterans of constant frontier warfare, used to fighting Germanic tribes and Persian armies. The Praetorians were essentially riot police with delusions of grandeur. When the two forces clashed, the outcome was predictable. The Praetorians broke and ran, many drowning in the Tiber in their heavy armor. Those who survived fled into Rome, hoping the city walls would protect them. Constantine's pursuit into Rome and the subsequent dismantling of the Praetorian Guard was systematic and thorough. He didn't just discharge them. He destroyed their institutional infrastructure. The Castra Praetoria was torn down, its stones repurposed for other buildings. The guards' records were burned or confiscated. Their accumulated wealth was seized. Their traditions were deliberately erased. Constantine wanted to ensure that no future emperor could resurrect the Praetorian Guard or create something similar. The creation of the Scholae Palatinae as a replacement was brilliant in its simplicity. By recruiting barbarians, Constantine ensured his new bodyguards had no connections to Roman political factions, no institutional memory of killing emperors, no sense of entitlement to political power. They were foreigners, loyal because they had no other patrons, controllable because they were outsiders in Roman society. This worked for generations, proving that the problem had always been the Praetorians' integration into Roman political life, not some inherent flaw in the concept of imperial bodyguards. Looking back across 3 centuries of Praetorian history, patterns emerge. The Guard was most dangerous during periods of weak imperial authority, when emperors were young, incompetent, or distracted by frontier wars. Strong emperors like Augustus, Vespasian, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius kept the Praetorians under control through a combination of respect, discipline, and regular payments. They treated the Guard as a necessary evil to be managed, not as partners in power. The most dangerous Praetorians were not the common soldiers, but the Praetorian prefects, who combined military command with political influence. Sejanus nearly overthrew Tiberius. Nymphidius Sabinus betrayed Nero. Latus conspired against Commodus. Time and again, ambitious prefects used their position to manipulate emperors or engineer their downfall. The office of Praetorian prefect was supposed to be a check on the emperor's power, ensuring he had competent advisors. Instead, it became a platform for usurpation. The Guard's relationship with the Senate was complex and ultimately destructive to both institutions. The Senate represented the old Republican aristocracy, still prestigious but politically neutered by the emperors. The Praetorians represented new military power, provincial in origin, loyal to whoever paid them. The two groups despised each other, but were locked in a dysfunctional relationship. Senators needed the Guard to enforce their decrees when they dared make any. The Guard needed the Senate to legitimize their choice of emperor. Neither could destroy the other, so they coexisted in mutual contempt. The Roman people had an interesting relationship with the Praetorian Guard. On one hand, they feared and resented these privileged soldiers who could murder emperors with impunity. On the other hand, Romans sometimes cheered when the Guard removed particularly hated rulers like Caligula or Commodus. The Praetorians occasionally positioned themselves as protectors of the people against tyrannical emperors, though this was usually post facto justification for murder driven by more selfish motives. The economic impact of the Praetorian Guard on Rome was substantial. Their high salaries and frequent donatives drained the imperial treasury. Emperors sometimes had to raise taxes or debase the currency to pay the Guard. The auction of 193 AD literally bankrupted the empire's finances for a generation. The Praetorians consumed resources that could have been used for frontier defense, infrastructure, or public welfare. They were an expensive luxury that Rome could barely afford, purchased out of fear rather than necessity. Militarily, the Praetorian Guard's actual combat effectiveness was questionable. They excelled at ceremonial duties, urban policing, and murdering unarmed emperors. But in real battles against trained soldiers, their record was poor. At the Milvian Bridge, they were routed. In earlier civil wars, they consistently lost to frontier legions. The Praetorians were soldiers in name more than in practice, their skills eroded by generations of easy living in Rome. The moral corruption of the Praetorian Guard reflected broader problems in imperial Rome. A society that tolerated emperor-killing mercenaries at the heart of government was a society with deep systemic problems. The Guard was a symptom of Rome's transformation from republic to autocracy, from a state governed by law to one ruled by force. The very existence of the Praetorians was an admission that emperors ruled through military power, not popular consent or constitutional authority. Yet we must acknowledge that the Praetorian Guard served genuine security functions. Several emperors were saved from assassination attempts by alert Praetorians. The Guard suppressed riots, controlled crowds during public events, protected the imperial family, and provided emergency response during fires or other disasters. Not every Praetorian was a would-be assassin. Most were professional soldiers doing a difficult job in a politically charged environment. The final irony is that the Praetorian Guard was destroyed by doing exactly what they were created to do, fighting a battle to defend their emperor. At the Milvian Bridge, Maxentius's Praetorians fought for their legitimate ruler against a usurper. They lost, and that military defeat gave Constantine the excuse to eliminate an institution that had plagued Rome for 3 centuries. The Praetorians died doing their duty, which is more than can be said for many of their predecessors who betrayed and murdered the men they swore to protect. Constantine's destruction of the Praetorian Guard ended a chapter in Roman history, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. Future emperors still needed bodyguards, still faced threats from within their own palaces, still had to worry about military coups. The difference was that post-Constantine emperors were more aware of the danger and more careful about how they structured their security. The lesson of the Praetorian Guard was finally learned, 300 years too late to save dozens of murdered emperors and prevent countless political crises. This, then, is the complete saga of the Praetorian Guard. Created out of necessity, corrupted by privilege, empowered by proximity to imperial authority, and destroyed when they finally faced soldiers who were better fighters than they were. They were supposed to be the shield of the emperor. Instead, they became a sword hanging over his head, ready to drop at any moment. For 3 centuries, they proved that the most dangerous enemy of any ruler is the armed men standing closest to the throne. To truly understand the Praetorian Guard's significance, we need to examine what they represent in the broader sweep of history. They were not unique in betraying their rulers. Palace guards and royal bodyguards have turned on their masters throughout history, from ancient Egypt to medieval Japan to modern Africa. But the Praetorians were unique in the scale, duration, and systematic nature of their political involvement. They weren't just occasional traitors. They were an institution built on the premise that loyalty could be bought and sold, and they proved it repeatedly. The Praetorians also highlight a fundamental paradox of autocratic power. An autocrat needs absolute control to maintain his position, but achieving absolute control requires delegating power to others, who then become threats themselves. Augustus needed the Praetorians to protect himself from assassination, but creating a powerful military unit loyal only to him meant creating a force that could turn on him or his successors. Every emperor faced this impossible choice: trust your guards and risk betrayal, or don't trust them and leave yourself vulnerable to external threats. Modern historians debate how much of the ancient accounts of Praetorian corruption were exaggerated, Our main sources, writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, were all members of the senatorial class who had reason to portray the Guard negatively. The Praetorians represented the military power that had destroyed the Senate's political authority. So perhaps the ancient historians emphasized the Guard's worst actions and ignored more mundane periods of loyal service. But even accounting for possible bias, the basic facts are undeniable. The Praetorians did kill multiple emperors. They did auction the throne in 193 A.D. They were disbanded for corruption and disloyalty. Even if only half the scandalous stories are true, that's still enough to indict the institution. The Praetorian Guard was a failed experiment in imperial security, a well-intentioned creation that metastasized into a threat. The social composition of the Praetorian Guard changed over time in ways that affected their behavior. Under Augustus and his immediate successors, Praetorians were recruited from Italian families, often from respectable backgrounds. These men had stakes in Roman society beyond their military service. They owned property, maintained family connections, and planned to retire into civilian life. This gave them at least some incentive to maintain political stability. After Septimius Severus reformed the Guard in 193 A.D., recruitment shifted to the provinces. The new Praetorians were career soldiers from frontier legions, often from less Romanized areas of the empire. They had fewer ties to Italian society and less investment in traditional Roman values. Some historians argue this made them more loyal to the emperor personally, since he was their only patron. Others suggest it made them even more mercenary, since they had no cultural attachment to Rome itself. The religious beliefs of the Praetorians also evolved in interesting ways. Early Praetorians worshipped traditional Roman gods, particularly Mars and Jupiter. Later, they were drawn to mystery religions and military cults, especially Mithraism, which was popular among soldiers throughout the empire. Some emperors, like Elagabalus, tried to impose their own religious preferences on the Guard, with disastrous results. The Praetorians were generally conservative in religion as in politics, resistant to change and suspicious of innovation. The daily routine of a Praetorian soldier was both easier and more complicated than that of a regular legionary. Physically, the work was less demanding. Instead of building roads, constructing fortifications, and fighting barbarians, Praetorians stood guard at the palace, escorted the emperor during public appearances, and patrolled Rome's streets. But the political complexity of their position was immense. Every interaction with the emperor or his courtiers carried political implications. Choosing which faction to support in palace intrigues could mean the difference between promotion and execution. One aspect often overlooked is the Praetorian Guard's role in imperial propaganda. Emperors used the Guard in public ceremonies to project power and legitimacy. When an emperor appeared before the people with ranks of Praetorians surrounding him, the message was clear. This ruler had military backing and couldn't be easily removed. The Guard's presence at games, triumphal processions, and religious festivals turned these events into displays of imperial might. Their legacy of betrayal endures through the centuries.